Greetings all. Welcome to Aquarian Diary. I'm your host, John Irving. It is August 7th, 2024. Just under 3 years ago, on September 23rd, 2021, I published my 11th episode here on YouTube. It is titled The 1971 Powell Memo and Why It Matters Now. The Powell Memo, which is sometimes referred to as the Powell Manifesto, was written by Lewis F. Powell, Jr., who was a corporate lawyer at the time. He was a conservative and had done a lot of work for clients like the tobacco industry. He was later appointed as a Supreme Court justice by Richard Nixon, and he served on the Supreme Court from 1972 until 1987. He passed away in August of 1998. I'm not going to repeat everything I said in the episode I published 3 years ago, but in short, Powell crafted a strategy for the plutocratic and corporate interests to regain control of the narrative and their hegemony that they felt was threatened by the countercultural movement that arose during the 1960s, which I attribute to the conjunction of Uranus and Pluto, which occurred in the 1960s, and most intensely in 1965 and 1966. This countercultural movement severely threatened the status quo and brought many, many issues to the fore culturally and socially, including women's rights, minority rights, the backlash to the military-industrial complex, and foreign policy. During this time, modern environmentalism emerged, new forms of spirituality were introduced, music, art, and many other areas of life were profoundly transformed, and we are still benefiting from a lot of those developments today. Powell's strategy was for these very entrenched and powerful and rich interests to recapture control over everything from the education system to the media to the judiciary to politics, workers' rights, unions, and so on. And if we look at the past over 50 years of history, we can see how this has played out very, very clearly. The reason I am talking about this today is because this morning, the online publication Slate published a story titled, "There's a New Lewis Powell Memo and It's Wildly Racist." This article, which of course I will link in the episode description, along with other related links that are important, this Slate article describes how documents have been discovered that clearly demonstrate that Lewis Powell was significantly motivated by racist attitudes. This is really important for all kinds of obvious reasons, and it adds a new dimension to this very old and important story, a story that still shapes American politics and social struggles to this very day. It's important to also note that Powell was celebrated by many institutions and publications, including the New York Times. He was quite highly regarded, even in liberal circles. But now we have clear evidence that he was a racist. And again, he was a Supreme Court justice from 1972 through 1987. So aside from the obvious, what does this have to do with you? Why am I so focused on this? I first became aware of the Powell Memo at least 20 years ago. And over the years, I have shared it with many people because it explains many of the political and cultural phenomenon that we have been grappling with, including the culture war stuff and what's been happening with the media and corporate influence over our lives and our affairs and our reality. In other words, there has been a deliberate strategy which has led us to where we are today, including the rise of figures like Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. Remember, the MAGA movement was kind of like a reincarnation of the Tea Party movement. And we know that, for example, the Tea Party movement was the brainchild of the Koch brothers, very wealthy, powerful, conservative, and libertarian industrialists who have funded a lot of right-wing think tanks, politicians, and policies over the years to protect their financial interests against the interests of the general population. And this, again, can be traced back to the Powell Memo or the Powell Strategy. We're even now seeing this worldview or ideology infecting the tech sector with all the libertarian tech bros and their bizarre and twisted philosophies and worldviews, who, as a matter of fact, have significantly influenced J.D. Vance. So it's infected many aspects of our world and society. To my knowledge, I was the first person in the spiritual community to comment or discuss the Powell Memo on YouTube, again, which I did just under 3 years ago. Helen from Irish Granny Tarot would later talk about it as well, perhaps inspired by my episode, but hardly anybody ever talks about this. And it's important because I think a lot of people in the spiritual community, first of all, are disengaged from these kinds of issues and think that what we've been experiencing is simply the ebb and flow of a cultural or societal phenomenon without really looking at the root causes of this, which are almost exclusively actually economic and related to power and control and influence. A lot of these plutocratic types actually want to install some kind of neo-feudalistic authoritarian system of governance on society because they just have this belief that they are privileged and superior and that the rest of us should basically just be serving their interests like we're chattel. And this is what a lot of people in the spiritual community don't seem to understand, that what we're experiencing is not accidental. And it drives me crazy because all you have to do is do a bit of reading and pay attention, and you'll realize that what's really driving what we've been experiencing, it's not coming from uneducated rural voters. It is being manipulated by powerful, entrenched oligarchs, basically, like what you find in Russia. It is not just some kind of spontaneous or organic groundswell. It is all being manipulated, and very deliberately. And there are reams and reams and reams of evidence to support this. Having worked on environmental issues for a long time, I can tell you that there is an incredible amount of documentation to support this, but I guess a lot of people are just too lazy to actually read or think about this deeply, and so they just assume that everything that's happening is just spontaneous or accidental, and it's not. Figures like Donald Trump and MAGA are a creation of powerful vested interests, quite literally. They are symptomatic of another problem, and hardly anybody in the spiritual community actually focuses on the root causes of what we're experiencing. There's a few people who do. Otherwise, Robert Reich talks about this quite a lot, but hardly anybody actually listens to him or takes him seriously. So again, I just don't know if it's a question of intellectual laziness or a function of just short attention spans, but we are not going to solve this problem unless we get to the root causes, and it's not what most people think. Again, none of this is accidental. It was all laid out in black and white in 1971. Coincidentally, our incomes adjusted for inflation have been declining overall since then. The media has been basically obliterated. Getting an education now basically involves being in indentured servitude. Politics has been hijacked by wealthy and powerful corporate interests, and everyone is focused on culture war issues, which are a divide and conquer strategy, a diversion so that the rich and powerful can get away with everything that they want. So people need to get real and focus on what's really important. It's not just about politics and culture wars or political celebrity figures. This is bread and circuses. The power that would like to put the genie back in the bottle, the genie that came out in the 1960s, is the very wealthy plutocrats. And if you look at policies, everything from taxes to environmental policies to economic policies, you can draw a straight line back to this root cause. So again, I encourage you to A, read the Powell Memo from 1971, B, read the Slate article, which conclusively demonstrates that Powell was also a racist, and C, people need to stop focusing so much on the puppets, in other words, the political figures, and we need to address the root causes of this problem because it represents a clear and present danger to humanity, democracy, civil and human rights, justice, our biosphere, and current and future generations. So as a refresher, the astrology goes like this. Uranus-Pluto conjunction, 3 exacts in Virgo, first one at the end of 1965 and then in the spring of 1966. The first opening square of Uranus and Pluto after the 1965-1966 conjunction occur with Pluto in Capricorn and Uranus in Aries between June of 2012 and March of 2015. There are 7 exact squares during that time. The first opening square is a challenge to the energies that manifested in the 1960s. And during that period and after, we have the rise of the alt-right or new right and figures like Donald Trump and other reactionary right-wing populist leaders and movements. And I have talked about these topics before. It's also interesting that this is coming up just as Mercury stationed retrograde, both in the sense that we're going back to something that arose in the early 1970s when Pluto was at the very final degrees of Virgo, and I'm going back to something that I published at the very beginning of my experience here on YouTube 3 years ago. For more detail, check the episode description for other episodes or articles that are related or that I mentioned. And if you're interested in a reading with me, I'll put a link to that as well. I have a 15% off special on currently. Many sincere thanks to everyone who supports me, especially my YouTube members. Thank you very much. Take care, all the best, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.